Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, on Gadigal land, land that was never ceded, sold or given away. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. This is Aboriginal land, always was and always will be. I'd like to thank the Refugee Action Coalition for inviting me to speak today and for continuing to stand up against the disgusting policies of the Australian government and over their treatment of these desperate asylum seekers. If we thought it was bad under the Labor government, the country has reached new lows in electing this Liberal government with its inhumane policies and total lack of transparency. We are rapidly heading for a state of incredible secrecy that will hide the treatment of innocent refugees, transporting them to unknown places in the dead of night. After screaming about the attacks on our borders and the never-ending stream of boat smugglers, this dangerous coalition government has gone from overkill to total secrecy. We shouldn't be surprised, though, as this is the same coalition-style government that sent the army into the Northern Territory Aboriginal communities to enforce the Northern Territory intervention, and it is typical that the military is also their preferred solution for dealing with the most vulnerable people fleeing from war and persecution. These techniques of secrecy and militarism are profoundly disturbing and are reminiscent of the sort of regimes that stink of totalitarianism and inhumanity. The sort of secrecy that the Abbott government is introducing is anathema to a freedom-loving democracy, and it must be resisted at all costs. If we stand by and allow one vulnerable group to be disappeared like this, we head for a path where other vulnerable groups will face the same situation. They'll be made invisible, with their treatment hidden behind a veil of secrecy. Consider the plight of the homeless and those in housing stress. Abbott doesn't even appoint a federal housing minister. We are cursed. We are cursed with a government that cares little for social justice and human rights. It is inconceivable to people of conscience like us that our successive governments strip asylum seekers of their basic human rights and defy the rulings of the United Nations Conventions on Refugees and on Human Rights. History will condemn us for these violations, and we are duty-bound to say no, not in my name. No, you will not tow back boats to Indonesia that doesn't want to cooperate. No, you will not transport human beings like cattle to concentration camps in remote island. You will not relocate refugees to a poor country that can't support them. No, these will not be done in my name. These actions are against everything we have ever come out on the streets and stood for, and must be exposed at every opportunity. These streets should be brimming with people this afternoon who are outraged at these developments, as this is one issue that we must never stay silent on. Abbott promised during the election to stop the boats on day one if elected, and hypocritically he's doing it by just not telling us that they're here. According to The Guardian, the 10th boat arrived on Friday the 27th, but the general public are blithely ignorant of these facts and of what happened to those people who arrived on those boats. Remember, this is a man who gave his support to a touring billboard that counted down every new boat arrival, but who now has insisted on a veil of silence over all asylum seeker issues. The idea of weekly press briefings reminds me of the Vietnam War years, when journalists were drip-fed US propaganda by the military media team. As usual, it will only be the Greens in federal parliament who will fight to break through this veil of secrecy. And it will be a fight that the Greens at all levels of government will be taking up. It will be essential that this action on the streets will support what battles we have to fight in the Parliament. I hate to use the language of war, of battle, but the next few years will be more draconian than the Howard era if the Abbott government continues with its agenda that strips away the humanity of our social system, such as removing support for Aboriginal legal aid, for the most incarcerated group in society, or dismissing the Climate Commission and all the projects on climate change. This government will make the Labor governments that preceded it look progressive, but we know we need real progressive and humanitarian policies that we need in this age of growing conservatism, austerity and global instability. Earlier this month, the Australian Human Rights Law Centre read out a statement to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which met in Geneva, condemning this government's proposed policies. This statement highlighted the dreadful precedent that the Australian government is setting in terms of the treatment of asylum seekers across the globe by its use of the military to deal with what are human rights issues. One of the most disturbing things that could be hidden by the government's lack of transparency is the fate of boats that sink at sea and how many people are lost when such incidents occur. As we have just seen happen with 2 boats turned back, at least 20 asylum seekers drowned, mainly children, with up to 70 missing and only 25 rescued before they gave up searching for them for the night, which means they couldn't have survived to the next day. However, it is a hopeful sign that this has been reported and that the media blackout is not as effective as the government would really like. We need to know how many boats are turned back and what fate these refugees face when their boats are returned, or what happens to them if they're not allowed to re-enter into Indonesian waters. All the measures that our recent governments have tried have involved trying to dump our refugee obligations onto poor Pacific neighbours like Timor-Leste, Malaysia, Nauru and Papua New Guinea. We have shown our true colours as a nation, a Pacific bully who will dump its responsibilities on countries that can't afford them. I am almost frozen with outrage at what is being done to these hapless refugees, especially the prospect of forcing them to relocate to Papua New Guinea, a country that is systemically unable to assimilate these men, women and children from totally alien backgrounds into their local tribal culture. Freezing is not an option for me though, and it is action that must be taken. We must continue to come out onto the streets and take every opportunity to say, no, you're not doing this in my name. We must walk towards setting up safe pathways and fast-track processing centres, which would give refugees hope that they will be swiftly assessed and sent to appropriate countries for resettlement. We must end the horror of remote detention centres and the insecurity of temporary protection visas and welcome these displaced and desperate human beings into our country. I thank everyone for coming out today, yet again, to stand up for the humanitarian and compassionate treatment of these poor people who could be any one of us or any of our families, but for the luck that we were born in the lucky country. And what can I say? Sadly, it's not so lucky if you're an asylum seeker. So finally, shame, Abbott, shame, not in my name. Refugees are welcome here. Thank you.